It is 50 days after Easter, and so it is Pentecost Sunday in the life of the church. Our Jewish siblings this week are celebrating Shavuot, the Festival of Weeks, which comes 50 days after Passover. And it was during the Passover celebration that Jesus was crucified, and so it is no surprise that his followers, all devout Jews, were gathered together when the day of Pentecost, or Shavuot, arrived. And the apostles are gathered when divided tongues, as if of fire, rushed from beyond and rested upon them. These tongues of fire land on the apostles, and all of them are filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Well, this miraculous ability to speak in other languages is important because we read that gathered in Jerusalem were people from all over. I'm not going to try and pronounce all the names and ethnicities. I made Anna Faith do that. It was way too hard. But it's important to note that suddenly the apostles can communicate with everyone gathered, and they preach to them, and we read that thousands were baptized that first day. You can give me a little less on this. I'm super loud. Sorry. It seems like a lot of people being baptized, given what we know about the relatively small numbers of Christians in the earliest years of the church. But this point still remains. When you speak other people's language instead of your own, you make it easier for them to belong. When you speak other people's language instead of your own, you make it easier for them to belong. And it is interesting to me that the gift of the Spirit here is not the gift of speaking in tongues, as we understand it from Paul's letters. It is not glossolalia, the speaking in an unknown language, but xenolalia, speaking in a foreign language. For example, if I say to you, "Me gusta hablar en español con mis amigos en Chiapas," you may recognize that as Spanish. You may not know what I said, but you may recognize it as Spanish. And if I said, "En beselek ejkichi majarul," well, I'm pretty sure none of y'all speak Hungarian because it's like the world's most impossible, terrible language, and Hungarians will tell you that. I'm not just being rude. But if you ask around and you encounter a native Hungarian speaker or a scholar of languages, they can tell you, yeah, that's Hungarian. Glossolalia, well, that's a different matter. It's speaking in an unknown tongue, and it's really interesting. There are documented cases of people speaking with what appears to be a coherent vocabulary and syntax and grammatical structure. They aren't languages, though, known to us, known or recognized by a scholar of languages as existing out there. Now, that's fascinating stuff, but it's more a topic for another day, because today, what interests me is that the Spirit is breaking down this wall of language that one person speaks, but another person maybe doesn't understand. The first act of the Spirit is to help us communicate, to tear down things that divide us and open the door to real communication and thus real relationship and real belonging. And I'd wager that anywhere a wall is being torn down, anywhere a divide is being erased, anytime people are different and yet can come together and get to know each other and celebrate together, there the Spirit is at work. And I love that the apostles didn't just come out and start preaching in Aramaic, their native tongue, the tongue of Jesus. They didn't say, hey, if you want the gospel, you're going to need to learn my language. The Spirit didn't let them do that. Instead, the Spirit grants them this gift of speaking other people's languages in order precisely to facilitate real belonging. And we encounter this situation every single week. Not that we encounter German or Swahili or French or other languages from other parts of the world. Think about insidery language, right? Acronyms, corporate speak, legalese, nonprofit speak, speech full of terms and words that people are expected to know, and a lot of people do not. So have you ever done any government work? You basically have to learn a whole new vocabulary of acronyms in order to navigate the bureaucracy, right? I am a rock-solid millennial, and Gen Z slang might as well be Hungarian to me, right? No matter what they're saying, I don't speak Zoomer. And if you want to feel old, try learning that as a foreign language. There is a time, there is a place for every kind of language, including the technical terms, the legal terms, the corporate terms. There are times an acronym might actually save you valuable time, right? I'm not going to yell at somebody in an emergency room. But most of the time, I think we fall into one of two bad habits. The first is that we use this language to essentially create an in-group and an out-group, a group of people who knows the language and thus is part of the crew, and a group of people who are outside on the other side. It's the same way that slang gets used very often. They will know I am not Gen Z if I try to use Zoomer slang, right? Spanish speaker, English speaker, Aramaic speaker, they're identity markers. People who know how to speak government clearly know their way around some red tape. Someone who doesn't speak corporate jumps out that really quickly as somebody who's maybe new to the job, right? Not part of the crew yet. It becomes a way of defining yourselves. It becomes a way of excluding others, the people who don't know the lingo. And sometimes it's not an identity marker. It's something that we sort of do to deliberately make things complex in order to kind of hold on to our own power. I mean, have you ever tried reading the fine print on something? Half the websites these days you have to click to accept the fine print, and it will take you a long time to decipher that fine print. There is an entire movement for plain English contracts precisely because these things have been weaponized, made more complex precisely to make it harder to understand what's happening when you agree to them. I have a college degree and a master's degree, and English is my native tongue. And the number of times I've received a piece of mail or encountered a contract or something and really had no idea what was going on makes me realize the intent was probably to confuse. Somebody with all the educational privilege in the world is still running into these problems. The intent might have been to confuse. A lot of this confusing language is confusing on purpose. Somebody doesn't want someone else to be able to understand it too easily. And we know all this. We know it's an identity marker. We know we get complex for no reason. But we still do it. We do it because we love this kind of talk. We love to use the fancy words to show that we know what we're talking about. Sometimes we're just afraid that if we use dumbed down language, people will think we're dumb. That if we have to prove to others constantly that we belong in this situation, that we really did earn that degree and we know all the language that comes along with it. So we speak their language because we want the status that comes from that kind of speech. But instead of status this week, let's focus on the spirit. Let's try to simplify our language so we can increase our communication. So just be intentional this week. Next time you write something or have a conversation, ask yourself, am I saying this in the simplest possible way? Am I using a buzzword or an acronym? Am I falling into legalese or corporate talk or nonprofit talk that I understand but maybe might be creating a wall to understanding for somebody else? And if you hear this language, be the person who says, wait, no, hold up. Could you explain what that acronym means? Because one person may think you're not very smart and you don't know what the acronym means. But somebody else out there literally doesn't know what the acronym means, and they're going to be so thankful that you were the one who stood up and said, no, let's hold on. Can we explain what that term means before we just keep using it over and over and over? You are doing a service to other people instead of chasing after status, and that is what God calls us to do. Be intentional. And that might mean, yes, especially if you don't look like me, or if you're in a room full of people who look like me, you may need to walk in there and use all the buzzwords so they know you know the language. But once you're in, once you're credentialed, once they get that you're part of the group, then try to simplify it so that the people who come after you, the next generation, the next hire, whoever it is, doesn't have to go through that same process. Pentecost is called the birthday of the church because it's this birthday of communication and belonging. It's this moment when the Spirit is breaking down these walls that would otherwise prevent the Christian community from being a place where we can actually get to know each other and share our lives. And it's incredibly important because what's happening, what's described in Acts, is Jews from every place under the sun. But the history of the church is that we will go on to become a majority Gentile church. So if you don't start by speaking the language of other Jews, how could the church have gone on to grow to Gentiles, to new lands, to new folks? So as we consider Pentecost and what it means to speak other languages, let's think not only in terms of us as individuals or our lives in the workplace, let's also think about how we might do this as a church. Because I mentioned legalese and nonprofitese. There's such a thing as Christianese, right? We've heard that. So if I said to you, our youth missions small group is going to offer testimony in the narthex before fellowship in preparation for their lock-in. Some of y'all know what I just said. Others of y'all are looking at me like I'm speaking Hungarian again, right? I can see it. So maybe instead of fellowship, we can just say, hey, we're going to talk and we're going to eat. One author suggested that we just translate it as organized gluttony, kind of like. Would work pretty well on a flyer. Maybe if somebody doesn't understand how deep and wide the notion of prayer really can be, we could just say we're going to have some quiet time with God where we listen and speak. We're going to think warm thoughts about you. We know we mean prayer, but if they don't understand what that means, that's okay. When we talk about our missions work, let's emphasize that Christ asks his followers to serve the poor and care for creation and to confront violence peacefully. And that we see that as our mission. And that's what we mean when we say missions. When we say God-fearing. I've heard 2 people this week tell me they don't know what that word means. God-fearing, we could say we're people who stand in awe of God and try to live our lives better because of it. Because the word fear just means something different now than it once does. It's a history of translation. Instead of, oh yes, we're all washed in the blood of the Lamb, we could say, yes, Jesus helps us share in people's suffering, and because of that, we are more empathetic and more committed to doing the work of justice and ending suffering for all. Maybe instead of just relying on saved, we could say, we made a conscious choice to let God help us away from violence and towards a life of love and compassion. We could just say donations instead of tithes and offerings, because there are people who don't know what that means. When we read our Bibles and it says, Jesus hated the world, we could explain, okay, the Greek word he's using there probably better refers to a way of running things that relies on domination and violence and conquest. And when Paul says that we're living according to the flesh, he means that we're living a life sort of governed by those sort of rules of violation and domination. So my point is not that any of these Christian terms are wrong or bad, and my suggestions might not be right, and they're certainly not shorter, but very often, coming to church for the first time is like learning a whole new language. And it's intimidating enough to walk through the doors of a new community and have to meet new people without having to learn a whole new language on top of it all. So we can trust in this beautiful process whereby we learn stuff and we learn to speak a new language, but let's do what we can to make it not deliberately confusing and not wait until somebody figures out how to speak our language before we can really find true and deep relationship. Instead, we should follow the Spirit. The Spirit that showed itself on Pentecost. This Spirit that drove the disciples to find people who were different and make sure that they felt like they belonged too. This Spirit that reaches out to you in every moment and says, you, yes, even you, can belong in this community. This Spirit that loves us with such wild abandon that drives us to erode barriers with such persistent energy that they literally thought the disciples were drunk at 9 o'clock in the morning because they were so frenzied. This Spirit that dismisses claims of shame and status, that calls us to risk our rank because a wild wind blows. And it will let us speak, and when we speak clearly, we can truly get to hear each other's stories. And when we hear each other's stories, we can belong to each other, and we can build something beautiful together. And we will encounter a God who moves in our lives, who is at work in the world still, a Holy Spirit that is there every time a wall comes crashing down.